A question for you. Who here is playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? Actually, have you already played Remake? I'm assuming yes, but you never know, even if Rebirth is a sequel. More to the point with Remake and Rebirth, if you are playing it, is it your first ever Final Fantasy game? Is it just your introduction to the entire universe, the entire series? I'd really love to read and see your comments about that down below. I'm very curious just to see who is coming into Final Fantasy for the first time ever on the backs of those games. I think they're awesome, personally, and that's coming from someone who played the original Final Fantasy VII. I think it's a really interesting take on it. Maybe that's another video for another time. But hopefully, if you are playing those games, it's encouraging you to be curious and check out some of the other games in the Final Fantasy series, and I know there are a lot of them. It's intimidating, really intimidating. As of right now, as I'm making this, there are 16 mainline Final Fantasy games. And I say mainline because we're not even counting all the orbital stuff that happens around these main games. So if you put them all together, it's going to be a lot. And that in itself is really intimidating. I mean, with all of those games, where do you even start with this series? Personally, I say just start with the game that you like the look of best, that sounds the most interesting to you, but I'll get back around to that at the end of the video. And I need to mention this to start off with. I feel like it's very important to note because what I'm about to say is the reason that I took years and years and years to even begin getting started with Final Fantasy. And looking back now, it seems kind of silly. If you're getting into this series for the first time, always remember that the mainline games are not all part of one giant long storyline. It's not one storyline in 16 parts. And that's why I took so long to start on Final Fantasy. I thought, there are 16 games in this series. It's already a really long, well-established story. I'll never catch up with the plot. I'll have no idea what's happening. By the time I catch up, there'll be 10 more games. No, that's not how it works. Each game is its own standalone story on a standalone universe doing its own separate thing. None of them are directly related, at least in the sense of it all being one storyline. They're all self-contained little stories. So hopefully that already makes you feel better as you're getting started. But having said that, across all of the games, there are some little elements that you will see popping up and recurring in most, if not all of them. That's not to say that these elements are directly linked, they're just nice little callbacks between games and give it a sense of consistency, even if you're basically playing a brand new story every single time. So like I said, you can pick up any game in the series and notice these elements and be like, hey, I recognize that, which is a really good feeling, and it kind of helps you feel a little bit less lost as you're jumping into stuff. So I thought, especially for you brand new Final Fantasy players who are getting into this with Remake or Rebirth or 16 even, a great place to start is with those recurring elements, just pointing those out so you can enjoy them too and look out for them as you're moving across through all those multiple games that await you out there. That was a long preamble. Shall we get into it? Let's get into it. So, multiple games, multiple worlds, multiple stories. But throughout all of these games, or I think all of them, maybe minus one or two, you will see a couple of recurring characters. And probably the most well-known of all of those recurring characters is Cid. Cid first appeared in Final Fantasy II, and he's anything from a player character to a knight, inventor, pilot, school headmaster, He's a regent of a city-state, a tribal leader, and in Final Fantasy XII, he's even one of the antagonists. Either way, he's usually an engineer of some kind, and always really good with airships, which, side note, airships are another recurring thing that you can see across all of the games. You'll also find Biggs and Wedge in a lot of the Final Fantasy games, and that's a Star Wars throwback. They're often around for comic relief, and they first showed up in 6, I believe. I'll also throw Jessie in there as well, because you can find her hanging out with them a lot of the time. How about monsters? I mean, we're in this game, we're playing the hero, we need to go out into the world and have something to fight, right? So in a lot of these games you can find curls, which are cat-like beasts. They usually have long antenna type things sticking out from their heads. There's also the Sahagin, which are a beast tribe in Final Fantasy XIV. They're basically fishmen. The Ahriman is a floating winged eye, which is horrifying, I hate it. Cactuars are literally small walking cactuses, and their 10,000 needles spell ability, whatever you want to call it, sucks. It does a lot of damage no matter which game you're playing. You'll find Malboros around quite a lot as well. They're huge, tentacled creatures with hundreds of eyes and teeth, and they usually have a bad breath spell, which they'll shoot at you and give you a bunch of horrible conditions that you have to deal with. The idea of goblins is not new to fantasy in general, but you'll find them a lot in Final Fantasy as well, and in 14 I actually think they're kind of adorable and cute, which is a kind of a turnaround for goblins as a whole. Then there's the Behemoth, which is a canine sort of beast. It's massive, has horns and a mane, and it'll crush you if you're not careful. But I'm leaving the best/worst for last on this section of the video, which is the Tonberry. And they're very difficult to describe. I'll put a picture here somewhere. They're kind of green, lizardy looking creatures that wear brown robes. Sometimes they hold a lantern and they have a little knife in their hand. And you also have the Tonberry King, who notoriously is very difficult and tough to beat. Classes or jobs are also a recurring theme across all of the Final Fantasy games, and the idea of job changing, or I guess free job changing, was first introduced in Final Fantasy III. You'll come across a bunch of recurring fantasy or MMO or RPG game classes as you play these games, but some of the ones specific to Final Fantasy are the Dragoon, the Black Mage, the White Mage, the Red Mage as well, and you've also got the Summoner, and I'll come back around to that class in a sort of tangential way in a little bit. Talking of mages, you'll see a lot of spells and spell types recurring across the games. For instance, you've got White Magic, which always assists your allies. Black Magic, which always harms your enemies. Red Magic is usually a combination of both. And then you've got Blue Magic, which mimics enemy attacks, and Green Magic, which applies all kinds of status effects to your allies or your enemies. So buffs, conditions, things that will tick over for a bit of time. But in general, there are spell names which you'll recognise quite a lot. And they also go up in potency. So say for instance you have the Cure spell, the next level up from that will be Cura, and the next level up from that will be Curaga. So you add an RA to the end and then an AGA to the end. So Fire, Fira, Firaga, that kind of thing. You get the idea. Items are also really important, and I feel like an underrated thing in these games just in general, like elixirs, Phoenix Down for when you inevitably die and need to be raised, or your party members. It's really handy for that. And now we come to one of my favourite recurring parts of the Final Fantasy games. I mentioned summoners earlier, and what is it that summoners summon? Great beasts with very specific powers, and they're referred to by a bunch of different names depending on the game that you're playing. So you'll hear them being called summons, eidolons, espers, guardian forces, aeons, avatars, primals, astrals, you name it. There's a bunch of names for them, but they're essentially the same thing across all games. They're usually named after characters from mythology, and they have specific spheres of power. So ice for Shiva, or fire for Ifrit, earth for Titan, and air for Garuda. I had to remember that off the top of my head. You also have water for Leviathan. Odin for lightning, I would say, or maybe that's Ramu. Correct me if I'm wrong down below. Maybe Ramu is lightning. But the way you use them in each game can differ a little bit. So, for instance, in Final Fantasy X, you have the character Yuna, who is a summoner. And she can summon these beasts to help out in combat whenever it's needed. In a similar sort of vein in 14, you can be the summoner job, and it has the same kind of idea behind it. You'll also see crystals quite a lot throughout all of these worlds, and that's going back as far as the first games in the series. In early games, they represent the Japanese classical elements, and they're meant to keep the world in balance. As a result, crystals in general are something to be fought over, because they hold a lot of the world's power. In some cases that power can be depleted, or it's used for energy, it can be used to teleport. Either way, it's a very central part of whatever world you're playing in. In 14, you can use them to teleport from place to place, and in 16, they're a power source which is slowly fading away. Of course, while this is Final Fantasy, not everything is kind of that old medieval style of fantasy storytelling. You do have advanced technology in a lot of these worlds, and often that's referred to as magitech. Literally technology that is powered by magic. In a few games like 6, 14 and 15, there's also the idea of armour, which is known as a mecha. In 7, it's known as Mako, so basically the lifeblood, the energy of the planet itself that's being harvested for human use and used as a power source. In 12, it's known as Magicite, once again different names for essentially the same thing. But often it's a metaphor for breaking the rules of the world that you're playing in, or being too ambitious for power, and stealing the planet's energy and just the consequences and ramifications of that. The rest of these I'll just fire through because they're little things that aren't really massively necessary to the plot, but they always pop up from time to time. Chocobos, for instance, which are nothing to do with chocolate, however the name sounds. They are yellow birds that you more often than not use for transportation or pulling goods along in wagons and that kind of thing. You've also got Moogles, who I absolutely love, and they usually run shops and offer services. Sometimes they're playable or party characters, but they're supposedly a combination of a koala and a bat that the creator dreamed up when he was still at school, way before he got to making the games in the first place. Sometimes you'll also see Gilgamesh popping up. He's a legendary character, and usually his whole deal is wanting to steal the most powerful weapons of the protagonist or that the world has to offer and claim them for his own. I can't remember if it's in Kingdom Hearts or somewhere else, but you can actually see him as a non-playable character, I think, with the swords of some of the Final Fantasy protagonists on his back, so clearly in one universe or another he was successful. And of course, across all of these games, you have a recurring theme. Now, back at the beginning, I did say that it's not one long-running storyline, but no matter which game you pick to play or what order you play them in, you'll find similar ideas and themes and lessons in each of them. You'll usually have characters that are almost always battling some kind of dominant evil or corporation, and there'll be a rebellion that they take part in. Beyond the overarching plot, though, there's always a deep focus on the personal plot of the characters themselves, and that can overtake the main plot sometimes, which I don't mind. You get very attached to these characters and their own personal trials and tribulations that they're going through. So that's a very brief rattle through some underlying and consistent themes that go across all of the Final Fantasy games. So now I have a question for you, another question I guess, down in the comments. First of all, which Final Fantasy is your favourite that you've played? And with that in mind, which one would you like to play next? For me, I think Final Fantasy IX is my favourite, probably partly because it's the first one I ever played, then 10, then 7, and then it's tough to say. I like 12. I feel like 14 should be in its own category though. That's an MMO and has been through so many beautiful, amazing storylines. Even better, if you are already a fan of Final Fantasy and you've played a lot of these games already, which of the recurring elements that I've mentioned before is your favourite? Which is the one that you look forward to seeing in every game and you get really happy when there's a reference or something related to it? I'm a sucker for cute things, so give me the chocobos and the moogles, and the summons, of course. I think those are awesome. I'm a sucker for mythology anyway, so anything related to mythological characters is right up my street. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found it useful as a starting point at least. If there's anything you think I've missed, and I'm sure there are quite a few tiny little recurring things that go through Final Fantasy that I'm probably not thinking of, let me know down in the comments below. And as always, I really appreciate you watching. Please don't hesitate to like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe because it means the world to me. The next video I make will probably be 7 specific. A lot happens in that game, and I know if you're playing the new ones, there's still some parts of the story that haven't been revealed, that might not be clear, and also just a lot happens before the games even begin, so I'm gonna dig a little bit into the history of Final Fantasy VII, in-game at least, and see if we can give some context around that. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and I'll see you in the next video.